Hey guys, welcome back. Um, Good to see you all. Hope you're going well. Um, I've just got in from a very rainy day. It's been raining all day, which is usually pretty miserable. But I'm in good spirits. I'm in good spirits, which is such a lovely thing to be able to say. Um, yeah, I don't know what I'm saying, but may I firstly just thank everyone for their lovely support of my amazing videos so far. Um, it means so much to me, and I'm extremely appreciative, appreciative. I don't think I can say that word, um, but you know what I'm trying to say. Um, Sweet, thanks, guys. So yeah, I'm gonna sort of rip into some more specific stuff that we sort of briefly touched on before. Um, when we were exploring the history and development of the Constitution, we sort of touched on um, the uncodified nature of it. And this is a topic that has been under the limelight for many years. Um, so it's no surprise that it's already been mentioned. Um, so yeah, we're just like we're talking about the sort of lack of document that contains the Constitution within the United Kingdom. And this is argued for and against by groups with varying political opinions. Um, and it doesn't necessarily fall within a binary camp, it's not like people on one side of the political divide argues for one thing. It's people with varying political opinions, and it's been a debate that's been going on for a very long time. Um, because the UK finds itself in a very unique position. Um, I think the most notable nations with similar constitutions are probably New Zealand, Canada, say Saudi Arabia, and Israel. But yeah, um, yeah, Israel. um, I personally I argue against the codification of our constitution. Um, I'll present a few arguments today as to why I oppose that. Um, and but also while saying that, I might probe a few alternatives to reforming our constitution, because I'm not of the opinion that it doesn't require reform. Um, I think it requires a lot of notice, but not in the form of codification. Um, so yeah, I think before before I've mentioned that you get a lot of arguments with people saying the constitution is unwritten, which I think is that is an incorrect statement. That is an incorrect statement. That's an incorrect statement. I say it 3 times because you will not believe the amount of people that say this. Because the Constitution it's made up of a variety of different conventions and legal instruments that have been accumulated over centuries. Um, so the lack of codification makes it unusual, but not unique. Um, it's not the only country that has an uncodified constitution. Um, um, the very nature of this has been an argument for codification, with people saying that the complexity and difficulty in understanding the Constitution is a reason for codification, given the sheer mass collection of texts, um, which I accept. Because of the history of it and the way it's been developed, it probably has resulted in the most complex constitution in the world. But I don't think attempts to codify it is the correct way to resolve this issue of complexity. You know, I reckon there's an argument to be made for consolidation of text and statutes. I think that's a more ideal way of solving the issue. Uh, you know, Referencing my lecture on accessibility of the law, I think that ties into it. It'll be easier to cite from legislation if you consolidate, yet still protecting the crucial aspects of our constitution. Um, And when you get onto things like constitutional conventions, which is such a central and crucial aspect of the Constitution, those will still be left intact with consolidation, which I think is extremely important. So the office of the Prime Minister can actually be considered as an example. Um, the Prime Minister is obviously the head of government and the most powerful public figure in the United Kingdom. Um, and a little bit of research from the Constitution Project found 16 provisions which mention the Prime Minister, and they found that they are in all three relatively recent statutes, being the Scotland Act 1998, Constitutional Reform Act 2005, and the Fixed Term Parliaments Act 2011. And they basically found that these statutes focus either on the role of the Prime Minister in the selection of various non-elected officials, such as the Constitutional Reform Act 2005, where you've got provisions dealing with Supreme Court justices, because obviously the Constitutional Reform Act 2005 established the Supreme Court and abolished the House of Lords as the final right of appeal, sitting as an appellate committee. And then you've also got the, it's referenced for the scheduling of elections in the Fixed Term Parliaments Act 2011. But not once is there any criteria for selection, or do they specify, sort of define any role for the office of Prime Minister. I concede that convention and their enforceability is entirely debatable. It's entirely up for debate. Whether conventions are even part of the Constitution is an argument you can make. I wouldn't necessarily go that far, but it's certainly an argument you can make, simply due to the fact convention doesn't have the force of law, and they can be ignored if circumstances make them inconvenient. Conventions are only rarely enforceable by the continued recognition of them. But I think that's also where the judiciary steps in and rules on certain matters, interpreting the law and applying it. And I think this strengthens the argument for consolidation. Consolidating our conventions. It'd be a tricky task, but a reasonable task. To ensure that the wording of consolidation would entrench our conventions correctly. But I reckon it would enable the enforceability of conventions that we have relied on for centuries. It would probably result in a fairly lengthy document, but one, you have to consider how formidable the codification of our entire constitution will be. The size of that document would be just immense. So I think we can live with consolidating our conventions and living with a fairly chunky piece of text. And by consolidating our conventions into written statute, you kind of ensure the protection of the conventions, which is so vital to our constitution. I'll say it again, and I think this would create an accessible way of engaging with some of the more archaic conventions. The UK is a democratic society that upholds human rights, or we hope. We've got a functioning representative system, and the theory of parliamentary sovereignty is legitimate. And the principle of democracy is manifested in the Constitution through statutes and case law, which guarantees the right to vote in fair elections, and through its use as a principle of interpretation by the courts. So I think you kind of get onto arguments against codification through this, because I reckon parliamentary sovereignty would be at risk under a codified constitution. A sovereign parliament is fundamental to our democracy, allowing elected members to possess the greatest power, which is to pass an act of parliament. There is nothing higher than an act of parliament. Even if the Supreme Court rules on something, if Parliament legislates in its place, there's nothing that can trump that, because Parliament is elected by the people. So this ensures democracy, and I reckon we risk losing some of that under a codified constitution, because a codified constitution could give the judiciary power to declare statutes unconstitutional, um, which we don't presently have. The courts have no power to overturn statutes at the moment. The Supreme Court can only determine or declare that legislation is um, acting beyond its powers. I'm not going to use the Latin term, but acting beyond its powers. Or they can issue a declaration of incompatibility under the Human Rights Act 1998 or the European Convention on Human Rights. So I think granting greater powers to the judiciary would limit parliamentary sovereignty and be wholly undemocratic. So yeah, I think, in fairness, it comes down to the drafting of this hypothetical codification, because the raw prerogative powers are currently wielded by the executive being the government, the state, and that they don't have a statutory basis. So would this remain the same in a codified constitution? It depends how you go about it. If you codify and you give the powers back to the monarch, you have two outcomes that would arise. You've got the politicization, another word I can't say, politicization. I don't think we ever. Okay, you understand what I mean. The politicization of the crown, and then you have a limitation on the powers of the executive. And obviously, if the executive is elected by the people in general elections, it should be them really, or the legislature, who wield these powers, not an unelected head of state in the monarch. So yeah, I think it comes down to the drafting of how you would go about codifying. But I think the main point here is that, and it's one that I've referenced before, I reckon the fluidity and the flexibility of the Constitution is one of its greatest advantages, and that would obviously be removed under a codified Constitution. I reckon if you codify, you end up with something completely inflexible, completely rigid. You just create stagnant parliaments. I mean, you look in the US, you end up with just complete legislative stagnation because nothing can get done. So yeah, I think in our current system it allows it to adapt to modern societies and unorthodox parliaments. You saw it during the whole Brexit drama. You had people like Oliver Letwin, hijacking the order paper from the backbenches. Which was in the end, that's a manifestation of democracy. Under the current system, if a member of parliament wants to amend legislation, you can introduce an amendment bill, and it will go through parliament. It will be given due process. It's not necessarily a complex process, and very rarely presents major difficulty. But under a codified constitution, the process would be far more difficult. Citizens and legislators would have to familiarize themselves with the constitution, and the legislative agenda could end up being stalled completely, which just ties into my previous point about stagnant parliaments. So I remember discussing this with an old friend many years ago, and he said, look, if it's not broken, don't fix it. Which I don't quite go that far. I think there are glaring issues within the Constitution. While its complexity may raise questions about its function or jurisdiction, attempts to improve a system that already works could be futile or even detrimental in some cases. It's functioned successfully for hundreds of years, producing stable government in the most part, not necessarily in the last decade or so, you could argue. But you get anomalies. You do get anomalies. I mean, particularly when you're dealing with the modern Conservative Party, you're bound to end up with an absolute clown show, which is exactly what we've had. It's been an absolute circus. But again, the Constitution has allowed for these events to happen, and you can swiftly move things on. It's able to adapt to these modern problems. And my final point is that you risk having a sort of judicial tyranny. Judicial tyranny could be a consequence of codification. Judges are unelected and not socially representative, meaning that they lack democratic legitimacy. And then this could result in a democratic deficit where certain groups are not reflected. Um, and again, you look to the United States. You have the complete politicization of the judiciary, um, which just demonstrates the potential consequences of granting courts excessive constitutional power. I dread to think of the possibility of us living in a society where the judiciary has been politicized in the nature that it has done in the United States. We've got the separation of powers. You've got the three branches. You've got the executive, you've got the legislature, and you've got the judiciary. When you if you end up with an overlap between the judiciary and the executive, it's bad news for all of us. Um, so I think that's my final point as to we can't risk having that, because the outcome would be just it would be, it sends chills down my spine. It sends genuine chills down my spine. Um, so yeah, I think I'm going to conclude there. I think I've exhausted a few points. I've beaten the dead horse enough for today. So yeah, I'm gonna go dry off. I reckon. Gonna have a nice cup of tea, perhaps. Maybe watch a film or hop on the old Xbox and yeah, just have a nice mellow evening. I reckon. One that will suit such a rainy day. Um, so yeah, I hope you guys are all going well. Take care of yourselves until then, and yeah, I'll catch you guys around.